Hello, fellow Americans. This is Mr. Steffler. I'm coming to you from room 111, and I am going to read The War with Mexico, Section 3. Our names and terms are James K. Polk, Manifest Destiny, Zachary Taylor, the Bear Flag Revolt, Winfield Scott, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and Mexican Cession. The main idea: the United States expanded its territory westwards to stretch from the Atlantic to Pacific coast. Why it matters now. Today, 1/3 of all Americans live in the areas added to the United States in 1848. One American story. Henry Clay sneered, "Who is James K. Polk?" Clay had just learned the name of the man nominated by the Democrats to run against him for president in 1844. "A mistake," answered a Washington insider. News of Polk's nomination was flashed to the Capitol by a newly invented telegraph machine. People were convinced that the machine didn't work. How could the Democrats choose Polk? A joke? Polk is America's first dark horse candidate who received an unexpected support. Democrats had nominated this little-known man only when they could not agree on anyone else. Still, Polk was not a complete nobody. He had been the governor of Tennessee. He had served 7 terms in Congress, and Polk was committed to U.S. expansion. He vowed to annex Texas and take over Oregon. Americans listened and voted. And when the votes were counted, Clay had his answer. James K. Polk was the 11th president of the United States. During his campaign, Polk's idea about expanding the country captured the attention of Americans. As you will read in this section, after the election, Polk looked for ways to expand the nation. American support manifests destiny. The abundance of land in the West seemed to hold great promise for the Americans. Although populated with Native Americans and Mexicans, those lands were viewed by white settlers as unoccupied. Many Americans wanted to settle those lands themselves, and they worried about competition from other nations. Mexico occupied the Southwest lands, and Britain shared the Northwest Oregon Territory with the United States. Many Americans believed the United States was destined to stretch across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. In 1845, a newspaper editor named James O'Sullivan gave a name to that belief. Our manifest destiny is to overspread and possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and self-government. John O'Sullivan. John O'Sullivan used the word manifest to mean clear and obvious. The word destiny means event sure to happen. Therefore, manifest destiny suggested the expansion was not only good, but bound to happen, even if it meant pushing Mexicans and Native Americans out of the way. After Polk's election in 1844, manifest destiny became government policy. The term manifest destiny was new, but the idea was not. By the 1840s, thousands of Americans had moved to Oregon. Since 1818, Oregon had been occupied jointly by the United States and Britain. In his campaign, Polk had talked about taking over all of Oregon. 54-40 or fight, screamed one of his slogans. The parallel of 54-40 north latitude was the northern boundary that was shared in Oregon. Rather than fight for all of Oregon, however, Polk settled for half. In 1846, the United States and Great Britain agreed to divide Oregon at the 49th parallel. This agreement extended the boundary line already drawn between Canada and the United States. Today, this line still serves as the border between the United States and Canada. Troubles with Mexico. Polk had a good reason for avoiding war with Britain over Oregon. By 1846, he had much bigger troubles brewing with Mexico over Texas. In 1845, Congress admitted Texas as a slave state in spite of Northern objections to spread slavery. However, Mexico still claimed Texas as its own. Mexico angrily viewed the annexation as an act of war. To make matters worse, Texas and Mexico could not agree on the official border between them. Texas claimed the Rio Grande, a river south of San Antonio, was the southern boundary. Mexico insisted that the Nueces River as the boundary of Texas. The difference was a distance between the two rivers was more than 100 miles at some point. Many thousands of miles of territory were at stake. Mexico said it would fight to defend its claim. Hoping to settle the dispute peacefully, Polk sent John Slidell, a Spanish-speaking ambassador, to offer Mexico $25 million for Texas, California, New Mexico. But Slidell's diplomacy failed. Believing that American people supported his expansion plans, Polk wanted to force the issue with Mexico. He purposely ordered General Zachary Taylor to station troops on the northern bank of the Rio Grande. This river bank was in the disputed territory. Viewing this as an act of war, Mexico moved an army into place on the southern bank. And on April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry unit crossed the Rio Grande. They ambushed an American patrol and killed 16 American soldiers. When the news of the attack reached Washington, Polk sent a rousing war message to Congress saying, "Mexico has invaded our territory, shed American blood on American soil." 2 days later, Congress declared war. The war with Mexico began. Thousands of volunteers, mostly from the western states, rushed to enlist in the army. Santa Anna, who was president of Mexico, built up the Mexican army. However, the Americans had mixed reactions to Polk's call for war. Illinois Representative Abraham Lincoln questioned the truthfulness of the president's message and the need to declare war. Northeasterners questioned the justice of men dying in such a war. Slavery became an issue in the debates over the war. Southerners saw expansion into Texas as an opportunity to extend slavery and increase their power in Congress. To prevent this from happening, anti-slavery representatives introduced a bill that prohibited slavery in any land taken from Mexico. Frederick Douglass, an abolitionist, summarized these arguments. The determination of our slaveholding president to persecute a war and possibility of his success in wringing from the people men and money to carry it on, it is made evident. None seem willing to take their stand for peace at all risks, and all seem willing that the war should be carried on in some form or another. Frederick Douglass, The North Star, 1848. Despite opposition, the United States plunged into war in 1846. General Taylor led troops into Mexico, and many Americans thought it would be easy to defeat the Mexicans. The war would end quickly. Capturing New Mexico and California. Not long after the war began, General Stephen Kearny, a U.S. officer, led men from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, with orders to occupy New Mexico when they were to continue west to California. As his troops marched along the California Trail, they sang a song like this one. "Old Colonel Kearny, you can bet, we'll keep the boys in motion till Yankee land includes the sand of the Pacific Ocean." 6 weeks and 650 hot and rugged miles later, Kearny's army entered New Mexico. Using persuasion instead of force, he convinced the Mexican troops that they were meant to withdraw. This allowed him to take New Mexico without firing a shot. When Kearny and a small force of soldiers marched toward California, which only had 6,000 Mexican residents, the remainder of the force moved south towards Mexico. In California, Americans led by explorer John C. Fremont rebelled against Mexican rule in the Bear Flag Republic. They arrested the Mexican commander of Northern California and raised a crude flag showing a grizzly bear sketched in blackberry juice. The rebels declared California independent of Mexico and named it the Republic of California. In the fall, U.S. troops reached California and joined the forces with the rebels. Within weeks, Americans controlled California. Invasion of Mexico. The defeat of Mexico proved far more difficult. The Mexican army was much larger, but the U.S. troops were led by well-trained officers. American forces invaded Mexico in two different directions. General Taylor battled south from Texas towards the city of Monterrey in northern Mexico. On February 22, 1847, his 4,800 troops met General Santa Anna's 15,000 troops near a ranch called Buena Vista. After the first day of fighting, Santa Anna sent Taylor a note offering him a chance to surrender. Taylor declined. At the end of the second bloody day of fighting, Santa Anna reported both armies have been cut to pieces. However, it was Santa Anna who retreated after the Battle of Buena Vista. The war in northern Mexico was over. In southern Mexico, fighting continued. A second force led by Winfield Scott landed at Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico. They battled inland towards Mexico City. Outside the capital, Scott met fierce resistance at the castle of Chapultepec. About 1,000 soldiers and 100 young military cadets bravely defeated the fortress. Despite their determined resistance, Mexico City fell to Scott on September of 1847 as he watched a Mexican officer sigh and said, "God is a Yankee." The Mexican Cession. On February 2nd, 1848, the war officially ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In the treaty, Mexico recognized Texas as part of the United States and the Rio Grande as the border between the two nations. Mexico also ceded or gave up a vast region known as the Mexican Cession. This area included present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. Together with Texas, this land amounted to about half of Mexico. The loss was a bitter defeat for Mexico, practically because many Mexicans felt the United States had provoked the war in hope of gaining the Mexican territory. In return, the United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million. The United States would also pay $3.25 million of claims the U.S. citizens had against Mexico. Finally, it promised to protect the 80,000 Mexicans living in Texas and the Mexican Cession. Mexicans living in the United States saw the conquest of their land differently. Suddenly, they were a minority in a nation with a strange language, culture, and legal system. At the same time, they would make important contributions to their new country. They taught new settlers how to develop the land for farming, ranching, and mining. The rich new culture resulted in a blend of many cultures in the Mexican Cession, from sea to shining sea. The last bit of territory added to the continental United States was a strip of land in southern New Mexico and Arizona. The government wanted this land for a location for a southern transcontinental railroad. In 1853, Mexico sold the land called the Gadsden Purchase to the United States for $10 million. On July 4, 1848, in Washington, President Polk laid the cornerstone of a monument to honor George Washington. In Washington's day, the western border was the Mississippi River. The United States in 1848 now stretched from sea to shining sea. In August, Polk learned that gold had been discovered in California. In the next section, you will read about the California Gold Rush. Main ideas. How did the acquisitions of Oregon and the Mexican Cession relate to the idea of manifest destiny? B, why were some people opposed to the war with Mexico? And D, what does the phrase sea to shining sea mean? Thank you for listening. God bless you, and God bless America.